Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Strategies for Managing Dollar Spot and Brown Patch, presented by Syngenta and taught by Matt Giese and Lisa Beirn, Ph.D. My name's Lisa Wick. I'm your moderator today, Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs here at GCSAA. Before I turn things over to Matt and Lisa, I want to thank Syngenta for their support of various GCSA programs and services and for presenting this webinar today. Syngenta has been a proud supporter of GCSA for many decades. Their commitment to the industry goes beyond their trusted product portfolio. Syngenta is passionate about superintendents, their health, and the health of their courses, with expert technical support, educational resources, comprehensive agronomic programs, and several digital tools on Greencast. Syngenta is dedicated to helping superintendents condition their course and themselves to perform at their best. We thank them for their support. Couple of quick housekeeping notes. We are recording today's event. You'll receive access to that recording via follow-up email. We do have a handout available in the GoToWebinar control panel. If your control panel has minimized, you're going to see a little narrow strip with an orange rectangle at the top. Click on that. The control panel will open back up. You'll be able to access that handout to download. You'll also be able to access the question answer box. You could type in questions as we go, or in the bottom part of that tab, you'll see a raise hand button. If you would like to be unmuted, because all audio is muted in this system of attendees, you can click that raise hand and I'll unmute you at an appropriate time and you can ask your question directly. Today's session is eligible for external education points through GCSAA, and we'll read a code to you at the end of the webinar that you can use on the GCSA website to get those education points. And Matt Giese, MS, is the Midwestern U.S. Technical Manager for Syngenta and has worked for them for more than 25 years. He earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Nebraska, the latter in turf and turfgrass management. Lisa Beirn, Ph.D., is a research and development field scientist for Syngenta. She received her bachelor's degree in biological science from Cook College, Rutgers University, and her master's and PhD in plant biology from Rutgers. I want to thank them again for their support, and I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. Good morning and welcome everyone to Managing Dollar Spot and Brown Patch. I'm going to kick things off this morning for us, and then about halfway through I will turn it over to Matt Giese. Just a quick agenda so you know where we are headed with this webinar. We're going to talk about dollar spot and brown patch today, and we'll start with conditions optimal for disease development for dollar spot and transition into brown patch. From there, we will look at control options and we will talk about broad spectrum disease control options. So I'd like to start this morning by talking about dollar spot. And if you are not aware, the pathogen that causes dollar spot was recently renamed in 2018. So it was formerly called Sclerotinia homeocarpa, and recently it was renamed to a new genus called Clariredia. And within that genus, 4 species were reported, and the most prevalent ones to, I think, most turf practitioners in the US are Clariredia jacksonii, which is highlighted here in green. And this is the pathogen that is responsible for most of the modern day epidemics that we see in cool season turf. The other pathogen that is relevant to maybe a few on the call would be Clariredia monteithiana, which is also widespread in the United States, and it's responsible for most modern day epidemics in warm season turf. So you'll see those names popping up in literature. So get familiar with those. Now, recently in 2019, there was one additional species reported within the genus Clariredia paspali, and this is a pathogen that was reported on seashore paspalum and carpet grass from eastern and southern China. And so While we might not be talking about this particular pathogen today, I think what it highlights is the diversity of species within this genus. And I think as we move forward, there will be more and more fungi reported within the Claridia genus. So something to be aware of. Okay, so we will focus on Claridia jacksonii today and knowing the symptoms of dollar spot, the conditions that favor dollar spot, and management tips. Now, the symptoms of dollar spot can vary based on the height of cut. So on close height of cut, things like greens, tees, and fairways, these spots are that very familiar dollar spot size patch of about 1/2 inch to 2 inches in diameter. It's very bleached, white and straw colored. If it is left unchecked, like you see in the photo there on the left, the spots can coalesce and blight larger areas, and you can get pitted depressions in the turf. Now, on higher height of cut, such as green surrounds, bunker faces, roughs, those spots can get a little bit bigger, and so they can be anywhere from 3 to 4 inches. It's not uncommon to see bleached and tan to straw-colored leaves, and those spots can coalesce to blight fairly large areas. If you're out in the early morning when the dew is present, you may be able to see the white cobweb-like mycelium on top of the turf. Dollar spot is very common anytime from late spring to late fall, but we most commonly see the disease in mid-spring. Start acting up when the average night temperatures are anywhere from between 55 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Symptoms can be exacerbated by prolonged periods of high humidity. So in the turfgrass canopy where that humidity can get trapped, that's what we need for fungal growth. So that's favored by warm days, cool nights, and heavy dews. We do see outbreaks in cooler periods in the fall, but it's most commonly under those heavy high humidity conditions that this disease really likes. Much more common under poorly nourished turf and dry soil conditions. Now, in terms of management tips, there's a lot of cultural practices with dollar spot that can help reduce infection. And a lot of these are common to a lot of turfgrass diseases. So reducing thatch, increasing air circulation so you can reduce the humidity, avoiding drought stress, irrigating the turf frequently so it's not drying down when the disease is active. Rolling, mowing in the morning, dew removal, you're removing some of that moisture on the leaf surface. There's a lot of research in that area that shows that those practices can help reduce dollar spot. But you can also, especially for bentgrass, bentgrass, you can consider converting to a cultivar that has increased dollar spot resistance. So there's a lot of those out there, and you can visit, your university NTIP trials to review cultivar data. And when needed, you can apply appropriate systemic fungicides on a preventative basis. Now, if you already have dollar spot, managing it in post-infection is a little bit different than what we do preventatively. So if you're interested in needing to treat this curatively, what you really need to consider is tank mixing this with a contact fungicide and a systemic fungicide. So that combination will really give you improved control of dollar spot outbreaks. And so what you're looking at here on the right is a trial from the University of Wisconsin where they had very high disease pressure and they went out with Secure curatively. And so this photo is 6 days after curative application. And so what we see with those curative applications is that if you have a contact fungicide in there like Secure, you're knocking back a lot of that inoculum load in the plots. Now, after the disease subsides, something you can do is you can apply nitrogen to help enhance recovery, especially in those areas where you have a lot of symptom development. So on fairways, we're talking about 1/4 pound of N to enhance recovery. Greens and collars and approaches, you would want to do spoon feeding of a slightly lighter rate every 10 to 14 days to promote some recovery in the turf. And nitrogen is one of these factors that can really play a big role on dollar spot severity. And so what you're looking at here in this photo is the impact of nitrogen on this disease. So on the left, that area has received 6 pounds of nitrogen, and on the right, you have none. And so you can see how powerful nitrogen can be in managing dollar spot. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the research that's come out of Dr. Paul Koch's program at the University of Wisconsin. And so what he did a study looking at nitrogen on the effect of dollar spot. And so essentially what he did was applied 1/10 of a pound of nitrogen every, 10 times or so to reach those annual N rates that you see there. And he looked at dollar spot development over time. So he compared that to a non-treated that didn't receive any nitrogen or a fungicide-based program. And what you're looking at here is the disease development over the entire season. So this is dollar spot over the whole length of the trial. And what you can see is that we didn't really start to see any differences in nitrogen rate until we were up here at this very this higher rate of nitrogen that he looked at. And so this is the 6 pounds of nitrogen per year in the study, and that's where you start to see the dramatic drop in dollar spot and providing some control that's similar to a fungicide program. So moving on to brown patch, we're going to talk about some of the similar things we just talked about for dollar spot. So the disease symptoms, the conditions that favor disease, and some management tips. And so brown patch is caused by the fungus Rhizoctonia solani. And just like we see with dollar spot, the symptoms can vary based on the height of cut of turf that you have. So on close cut turf, typically what we see are these circular spots. They can be anywhere from 3 inches to 3 feet in diameter. They can appear very, very quickly. So if the environmental conditions are right, it almost seems as if the symptoms can just pop up overnight. And what you tend to see is this grayish mycelium in these smoke rings, as we call them, on the periphery of the patch. In higher cut turf, tall fescue is a nice example, as you see in the photo on the right here. The leaf lesions are very common. And so you'll see the brown blighting and the twisting of leaves like you see in the photo there on the right.
Hey, Lisa, I'm going to interrupt you for just one
Okay.
sec. There was a question about that nitrogen. Does the amount of N differ for turfgrass species?
So the answer would be yes, but what they looked at in that particular trial was just looking at nitrogen overall. And so for something like dollar spot, if you are under, right around that 6 pounds of N, you'll start to see the disease go down regardless of your species.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for brown patch, the conditions that favor development here, anytime we're seeing this, we typically don't see this disease in the spring. We see this more in summer to early fall. And the disease is favored by night temperatures greater than 63 degrees. This disease in particular likes it a little bit warmer and hotter and humid than dollar spot. So prolonged periods of high humidity in the turf canopy are required for fungal growth. So this is really favored by long hours of high humidity, leaf wetness, very common in areas with poor circulation, poor water management, and like we have in the summertime, often these afternoon thunderstorms following a dry spell. And so this is also a disease where nitrogen can influence the disease development. And so we'll talk about that a little bit in some of the research coming out surrounding brown patch and nitrogen. So this is a trial done by Dr. Jim Kearns in North Carolina State University. And what they did here is they applied nitrogen at different times. And so you can see the timings here in the left side of the column. But they always tried to reach 3 pounds of nitrogen a year. So the timings were different of when they applied that nitrogen, but they reached the same max load, and they looked at brown patch severity in 2 years. And so this is also the severity over the entire season, which is why these numbers look quite large. And so what you're seeing in 2015 and 2016 is that regardless of the timing, at 3 pounds of nitrogen per year, there was no difference in brown patch severity. So we've often learned that nitrogen can influence this disease. So what they did to follow up on this study was they increased their rates of nitrogen. And so they went all the way up to 6 pounds of nitrogen per year. And what you see here is there was no difference in 2015, but in 2016, when you got up to 6 pounds of nitrogen per year, you had a significant increase in the amount of brown patch. And so it's very high rates that are needed to see an increase in brown patch. So that kind of ties into the cultural practices that can reduce brown patch infection. And so what we just saw is that less than 6 pounds of nitrogen annually won't increase your disease for brown patch. And along with that, we want to do some of the typical things that we talked about earlier. We want to improve air circulation, minimize shade, improve surface water drainage, avoid high turf canopies that will keep it more humid, reduce your thatch. If you irrigate in the pre-dawn hours, and that can knock down the mycelium and reduce brown patch severity. And when necessary, systemic fungicides on a preventative basis are a very useful tool. So managing brown patch, if you already have it, this is very similar to the dollar spot. If you're looking to treat this curatively, it's best to tank mix a contact fungicide with a systemic product for the same reasons we talked about with dollar spot, is you want to knock back the pathogen that's already there. So after that disease subsides, you can then return to a systemic fungicide program. Now, it's important to know what your fungicides control moving forward because there are many different fungicides out there on the market and many different classes of products. And today we're talking about dollar spot and brown patch, but there are a lot of other diseases out there, and not all products will work on all diseases, and some will work on both. So it's very important to read the label and know what your fungicides are treating. And one of the fungicides I want to highlight for a few minutes is Posterity Fungicide, which is a new fungicide in the SDHI chemistry class that was brought out by Syngenta. And the active ingredient in there is Ph.D. flumetifen. This is in FRAC group 7, so in the SDHI group. And this is a fantastic dollar spot product. And so if we transition to our next slide here, maybe. There we go. What you're looking at here is photos of treated plots at Rutgers University for 2016, an untreated dollar spot check on the right, and a plot treated with Posterity on the left. And so this is a really phenomenal dollar spot product. And so part of what Syngenta has done and what you'll see coming out in the next few weeks is building on this Posterity family. And so we've just talked a little bit about Posterity Solo, which is a very strong dollar spot product, up to 28 days of control. We do see a very good control of spring dead spot, and this is in FRAC group 7. So to build on that, we'll be introducing Posterity XT and Posterity Forte to you today. Posterity XT is a broad spectrum product. It controls a wide array of cool season turf diseases. And you will see control of summer patch, leaf spot, take all, gray leaf spot. But today we'll be focusing a little bit on the brown patch and the strong dollar spot control of this product. So this product is in frac group 7, 11, and 3. And so this has a QOI, azoxystrobin, and a DMI propiconazole in this mix. Posterity Forte is a highly rated spring dead spot on take-all product. And so we won't be focusing on those today, but what we'll be looking at is the dollar spot control and the brown patch control with this particular product. And so this is also the same frac groups as Posterity XT. The loading of the active ingredients in these products is different. And so Posterity Forte has a little bit, has a stronger load of Ph.D. fumetifen and lower QOI and DMI loads. And so you'll hear about more of those in the next coming slides. But this is not all we have to introduce to you today. So we also want to talk about some of the other things coming to market. And another product would be Ascernity. So this is a combination of an SDHI, SOLATENOL, and a DMI, difenoconazole. So this product is very active on Rhizoctonia diseases and dollar spot. Also has very good control of anthracnose and large patch, but we're going to focus on the brown patch and dollar spot today. And so I think what I'm going to do is transition here to the next slide, and this is a good place for me to turn it over to Matt Giese.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Lisa Wick, is there any questions we need to address before we move into the next section?
Thank you for asking, but I don't see any at this time.
Okay, very good. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for a few minutes. I think Lisa did a fantastic job of, kind of talking about some of the cultural practices, which really are really important when we start talking about managing these diseases. But what happen in many situations is weather conditions can certainly be very conducive for these diseases, especially I would say across the Midwest over the last 4 to 6 weeks into the Northeast and probably well into the transition zone. We have seen these particular diseases and probably beyond, we've seen these particular diseases become very problematic. And so sometimes cultural practices just aren't enough to keep them in check. And so, we talk about what other methods that we can use to really control these particular diseases. And so what I'd like to share with you over the next few minutes is some new introductions, and Lisa's done a nice job of kind of overview, and so we'll dig a little bit deeper into each one of those products and really give you a comfort level of where they fit in terms of looking at both dollar spot and brown patch control in golf course turf. So let's jump right in and we'll talk just briefly here about Posterity XT. As Lisa said, this is building on the foundation of Posterity, and so XT really includes not only the adaptogene molecule, which is what is present in Posterity, but also the components of Headway, which are propiconazole and azoxystrobin. And those are probably very familiar active ingredients that you may have heard of or maybe even used over the course of time. And so this particular product is 3 different modes of action. So you've got 3 different frac groups, one from the SDHI group, one from the QOI group, and one from the DMI group. This particular product is a suspo emulsion, and you may see this term here as I talk about Forte as well, because both of these products are SEs. And really, this isn't a new formulation technology, but it is one of the more difficult ones for formulation chemists to create. You have to take both dry materials and liquid active ingredients and keep them suspended in a formulation, which can be a challenge depending on the characteristics of each active ingredient. But it does go into solution really nice and stays into solution once you mix it in your spray tank. So it does a really nice job of dispersing from that perspective. XT has a warning signal word, and most of the products that we're going to be talking about here today have our use sites on golf course turf only. And so maybe to give you some reference points around XT, if you're familiar with Posterity and Banner Max and Heritage rates, this would give you a little bit of a reference point. So an ounce and a half of Posterity XT would be equivalent to the 0.08 fluid ounce rate of Posterity. Would also have equivalent of 1 ounce of Banner Max, and also 0.2 of an ounce of the Heritage 50WG formulation. And then, of course, the 3 ounces is going to be double of all those equivalents that we would see in the ounce and a half. And so you'll see these rates repeatedly as we talk about particular disease control for each of those. And one of the things that XT really brings to the table is some versatility and flexibility. And by that, I mean you can utilize it from, on 14-day intervals. This happens to be some work out of Rutgers by Dr. Bruce Clark just a year ago here on Dollar Spot. And the idea was to look at both 14-day, 21-day, and 28-day intervals with different rates. And as you can see here, as we kind of look at the 14-day rate, Posterity XT at 1.5 ounces, doing an excellent job on 14-day intervals. Also tested here as a 21-day interval under some pretty significant dollar spot pressure. Here you can see the untreated here having greater than 250 dollar spots per plot. We're probably talking about a 5x5 plot here, so a very small area that we see this particular disease pop into. Also listed here for the 21-day is a middle rate, 2.2 fluid ounces of XT, and then of course the 3 ounce rate here on 21-day, as well as 28-day, doing a really nice job, again, under some fairly significant disease pressure in this particular trial. And so, that was Dollar Spot last year. Just another one looking at Dollar Spot here from just a couple of years ago. Again, looking at a 14-day interval with XT, doing a really nice job against a fairly moderate level of disease pressure on one particular rating date in August of 2018, and comparing that to August 15, just 10 days later, and look at the jump in the level of disease pressure that we see in XT at 1.5 ounces, really suppressing the level of dollar spot in this particular trial. And then on a 21-day, also looking at that medium rate of 2.2 ounces of XT, also suppressing disease and doing a nice job on 21-day intervals. So again, have some flexibility here to either go on 2-week or 3-week intervals, depending on what's most appropriate for your disease control program at your golf course. And so just a few photographs that represent that particular trial. So you see XT at that middle rate at 2.25 on a 21-day interval here on the far left, the untreated and the level of disease pressure that we saw in that particular trial, and then XT at 1.5 ounces on 2-week intervals, doing a really nice job of suppressing the dollar spot in that particular trial. So again, some flexibility here depending on what you're really focused on. The other part of XT, and as you would expect with the component, with the fungicide having a component of azoxystrobin, you would expect that it would be really strong against rhizoctonia diseases, including things like brown patch. And that is indeed the case, as we see here in this particular brown patch trial from last year, again at Rutgers, doing a really nice job of suppressing brown patch, even though this was conducted on colonial bent grass, which is a very susceptible species to brown patch, and you can see very high levels of disease here in the untreated checks, but really is more of an acid test, I think, when we start looking at 14-day intervals with 1.5 ounces of Posterity XT. So I think you can really rely on XT if you're having concerns about brown patch control, as well as concerned about dollar spot. The second product that I wanted to share with you today, and all three of these will be available later this fall, but Posterity Forte, again, is another member of expanding on this foundation of posterity. And you'll see some very similar components here with Posterity Forte compared to XT, with pideflumethafen, which is the active ingredient in Posterity, and then again propiconazole and azoxystrobin. Again, same frat groups, same formulation, similar signal word, and same use sites for Posterity Forte. And so you might ask yourself, well, why would you want to have two products that have basically the same active ingredients? The difference is that one of these, particularly Forte, is more heavily weighted with Posterity. So if you recall, the XT we really had for the equivalent of Posterity in XT, it was 0.08 fluid ounces per thousand, where the high rate here of Posterity Forte is 0.32. So that would be the highest rate if you're comparing that back to just a straight Posterity product. The low rate here is 0.16. So it has a higher loading, not only of the adepidin active ingredient, but it has a lower loading of propiconazole and azoxystrobin. So the equivalent here for the low rate of Posterity Forte is 1/3 ounce, and then just a touch less than 1/10 ounce of the Heritage 50 WG. And so what that does is gives you a little bit different spectrum than you would expect with Posterity XT. And with Forte, your focus is on certainly things like brown patch. You would expect that there would be some control, but with that lower rate of azoxystrobin in there, it's not going to be nearly as high. And I think that is necessarily the case, what we find with Posterity Forte. Now, this was some work that was done in 2015. This was done at 6 different locations, and so this is a summary of those 6 different locations, tested at the low rate of Posterity Forte, which is the 0.42 rate, and comparing that with headway at 1.5 ounces fluid ounces per thousand. And so this particular rate is actually not labeled for brown patch currently. The way the current label is structured, and sometimes that happens. We test rates before the label actually comes out. But what I think is important here to take away is that as you look at the untreated controls, which are the orange bars in this particular chart, you see the level of pressure within each particular location. And these light blue bars are the Posterity Forte, which again is a lower rate than what we would typically recommend, but we're still seeing a very good level of suppression of brown patch as we look across, especially in this New Jersey location where we had greater than 80, probably close to 90% disease in the untreated check. And even with that low rate of Posterity Forte, finding some really good levels of disease control, brown patch control in that particular trial. And I think, I thought I had some photographs of that trial, but maybe I'm thinking of a different one. This particular trial was, again, looking at several different locations again, looking at this low rate of Posterity Forte, that would be the equivalent of what you would find in the Posterity 0.16. And so Posterity Forte, these would have the same level of adepidin or the same level of the active ingredient in Posterity. So an apples to apples comparison here, looking at 28-day spray intervals across several different sites. And again, you can see that both of these are providing very good levels of dollar spot suppression, and especially in this Wisconsin trial in this particular year had very high level of dollar spot severity. When we're almost at 700 dollar spot counts per plot. So that's an extremely high level of dollar spot pressure, and both of these products are doing a very nice job of keeping them in check. Here's the slide I was looking for earlier. This is the dollar spot control from Rutgers. Again, looking at 28-day intervals here with Posterity at the 0.16 fluid ounce rate, or if you prefer, the 7-ounce rate per acre, and comparing that with Posterity Forte at 0.42, which be the equivalent of the Posterity at 0.16, also on a 28-day interval here, and doing a very nice job. And again, you can see the level of disease pressure here in that center photo, which is indicative of the pressure that was present in the untreated check. And so just a couple slides here on brown patch for Posterity Forte. This is some recent data. Actually, these were some data that were collected by Lisa here just last week, looking at Forte at the lowest rate that we see on the label for brown patch, which is the 0.63 fluid ounce rate per thousand, and also testing the high rate at 0.84. Both of these on a 21-day, really doing a nice job under some fairly extreme brown patch pressure that was occurring in the untreated check. And just a pictorial representation of that particular trial is represented here, where we see Posterity Forte at 0.63, the untreated on the far left, and then the high rate of Posterity Forte, both again on these 21-day intervals, doing a really strong performance against brown patch. And so the third introduction that I wanted to share with you, so we've kind of talked about the Posterity family, if you will, with XT and Forte. And so we'll change gears just a little bit and share with you a unique offering that also has some activity against brown patch and dollar spot, in line with our theme that we've kind of been talking about here this morning. And that is Ascernity fungicide. And Ascernity contains two active ingredients. You might be familiar with difenoconazole. That is the active ingredient that you'll find in the Brisquet product that Syngenta offers with what we consider a cooling DMI technology. But then it also includes SOLATENOL, which is a new introduction to the summer disease market. This is a product, there's a product for snow mold actually that contains SOLATENOL, but it's only labeled for snow mold, and that product is Contend. So this will be the first introduction of SOLATENOL into summer disease control, and it will be in conjunction with difenoconazole, and it'll be named Ascernity. And this will be a soluble liquid formulation, has a caution signal word, and will be for use on golf course turf as well. Now, if we think about difenoconazole for just a moment as one of the components of Ascernity, and if you're familiar with some of the rates with Brisquet, you'll find that there's about the same level of difenoconazole in Ascernity as there is in about 0.6 of a fluid ounce per thousand of Brisquet. And so that's a fairly robust rate of difenoconazole. And with the spectrum that we see with SOLATENOL, both of those provide a kind of a dual-pronged approach as we talk about both dollar spot and brown patch here today. So just a few slides to share with you on SOLATENOL. SOLATENOL actually is a trade name for the active ingredient. The actual name of the active ingredient is benzovindiflupyr. And this particular active ingredient belongs to the SDHI, to the pyrazole carboxide subclass of SDHI. And you can kind of see it here outlined in yellow. There are other members of this particular class, which include penthiopyrad, which is Volista, but it is separate from pideflumethafen, which is the Posterity. So once you have these different subclasses, and even individuals within the same subclass many times have different spectrum of diseases that they do control. And so one of the strengths that we see with SOLATENOL is really against the Rhizoctonia species, not only in cool season, but also in warm season turf. And so that is one of the positives that we do see with this particular active ingredient. And just to maybe share with you really some of its strengths in terms of disease development, you know, as you kind of look at how a pathogen develops over time, it really begins with a spore and then ends with sporulation, and then that kind of starts the whole process over. And so we see SOLATENOL fitting into the spore germination and the infection peg stage, as well as part of the mycelial growth stage, and really being more of a protective or preventive type of protection, whereas the difenoconazole also comes in that mycelial growth and lesion formation, and so it has a touch of curative timing to it as well. And so I think when we put these two together, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get protective, but if you have anything that also may be have an active infection, the difenoconazole has activity against that. So it makes a nice combination when we start talking about what Ascernity brings to the table in terms of disease development. And I think that's represented as we talk about, you know, things like brown patch. And so this is some work that was done by Dr. Brandon Horvath at the University of Tennessee, looking at brown patch, and these were 14-day intervals, looking throughout just parts of July here through the end of September, when disease pressure really tended to increase. And I don't believe I mentioned it earlier, but there's one rate for Ascernity, and that's 1 ounce per 1,000. And so you'll see here kind of on this photograph on the right where Ascernity was applied in multiple different locations in this particular small plot trial that Dr. Horvath did. But you can also see the level of some dollar spot actually occurring in some of these particular plots as well. But these darker brown areas are where brown patch is really popping up in the untreated checks. And so this photo was taken in early September, when a lot of this disease pressure that you see for this September 11th rating started to begin to manifest. So again, doing a very nice job of really keeping in check the brown patch. And so some additional supplemental data. This is some work out of Pennsylvania by Steve McDonald, and looking at Ascernity plus a number of combinations that you might typically see in a greens or even a fairway situation, looking at brown patch and dollar spot targets. And so Ascernity by itself doing a really nice job of control, but also any tank mix partners such as DAC Action or Secure, also supplementing what Ascernity brings to the table for very good level of brown patch control in this particular trial location. And some recent data here, as recent as last week, looking at some very high levels of pressure of disease of brown patch in a trial at Rutgers with Dr. Bruce Clark. In fact, we're almost seeing, as of last week, almost a 90% brown patch in the untreated check. And looking at Ascernity on a couple different intervals here, whether it's 14-day or 21-day, seeing a very good level of disease control with Ascernity on either one of these particular intervals under some pretty extreme brown patch pressure. So have a very good comfort level with Ascernity on brown patch. I think we see the same as we sort of look at dollar spot as well. And these are a few photographs from a trial that was conducted by Dr. Lee Miller at the University of Missouri here just a few years ago, looking at the untreated control versus Ascernity at 1 ounce per 1,000, and looking at some pretty good levels of disease. Both brown patch and dollar spot pressure were present in this particular trial in 2011. And so he also had a number of different tank mix partners that he was looking at for dollar spot. And again, you can see we're upwards of 140 to 150 in some rating dates, the number of dollar spots per plot, and Ascernity doing a very nice job on 14-day intervals. And even when we did a tank mix partner of either DAC action or secure, repeating that level of disease control. And our very own Lisa Beirn actually did a couple of treatments here just a year ago looking at dollar spot applications. And I'll call your attention to the treat dates here. And so you see the untreated here on the left. This was actually, applications were made the 3rd week in May, and this photo wasn't actually taken until the 1st week in July. So, we're looking at a long period of time where, yeah, we see a little bit of dollar spot creeping in to the Ascernity plots, but that's well beyond the 14 and 21-day interval that you would find on a label for dollar spot control. So I think, we really see some good levels of not only brown patch control, but also dollar spot control with Ascernity. So a good indication of what's to come there. And so, I think as we think about dollar spot and brown patch, not only from a cultural perspective, but what also do we have from a chemical perspective? And I think we have a lot of options. And I think that, these new introductions that we sort of talked about here this morning will really help drive, I think, some new options when we start talking, especially around fairway dollar spot control. I think in most cases we have a lot of good options for both of these diseases on greens, but sometimes we lack that a little bit for fairway and tee applications. And so as we look at really bringing these to the market, I think there are some things to consider. We've talked a lot about the cultural practices. There are certainly some resources there available, and I wanted to just bring to your attention that if you've not been to Greencast, there are lots of resources there to help you kind of manage both of these particular diseases. There's specific information on dollar spot solutions. There's information regarding the Smith-Kearns dollar spot model. If you've not had the opportunity to read about that or utilize that to really time when that first application in the spring really needs to be made, this is really a great resource that allows you to sign up for an alert, sends an email to your inbox, and gives you the ability to look at the forecast for dollar spot, you know, in the next 5 days, depending on where you're at in the course of the season. There's also some opportunities to look at soil maps. You know, if you're interested in what soil temperatures are looking like in your particular geographic area, you can type in your zip code. You can also have these delivered to your inbox. So really a nice resource to utilize when we start talking about you know, making applications, maybe not necessarily with dollar spot and brown patch, but making applications based on soil temperatures for different root infecting fungi. And so this again is a really nice resource if you're not aware. And so available on Greencast, there is the availability to sign up for agronomic alerts. And you can select dollar spot alerts, as you can see there in the first indication, but you can also sign up for any number of other alerts that you may have interest in, including soil temperature. And you know, we've talked a lot about these particular diseases today, and Lisa's done a nice job of detailing out sort of what they look like. If you're still having issues determining, you know, what's dollar spot and what's brown patch, there's also a disease identification guide that you can find on greencastonline.com, and can kind of help walk you through, you know, what to look for, what sort of foliar symptoms, you know, are there patches, you know, what are some of the things that are necessary when we start talking about identification, whether it's these two diseases or whether it's other diseases that you have interest in. It's really a nice resource that has some pictorial representation, pictures that allow to really help identify it from a visual sense. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and close and say thank you for joining us today. We appreciate the time. And if there's opportunity for questions, Lisa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Matt. There is a question here, and it goes back on that ID. I don't know if Greencast would have info that would be helpful, but the question is it true that brown patch has a dead tip as well as lesions on the turf, whereas dollar spot only has lesions on the leaf?
Yeah, that's a good question, and maybe I'll ask Lisa to chime in here as well. You know, I think that if you look at most textbooks for dollar spot, you'll find that there is this recommendation, or the identification characteristic of dollar spot is an hourglass lesion. And so sometimes you'll see that, sometimes you won't. Sometimes it will be completely up to the tip. Now, brown patch will have you know, lesions on the leaf as well, but sometimes in certain species it's difficult to tell the difference between the two, and so sometimes you might need a trained eye to look at those to make sure that, you know, you have what you think you have. And so any other comments on that, Lisa?
I would agree. I think that they can be variable and not necessarily just in one location of the leaf. So you can see the lesions in the middle, you can see them on the tip. So it could be difficult to identify that way. So I think the best thing I could tell you to do if you're not sure is to probably send in a sample to your nearest diagnostic lab, and they could clear that up for you.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, great. I am going to mention here Syngenta's arranged for education points. We thank them for that. And so individuals wanting to get education points will use the code 999-23333. 30910. You may want to write that one down with all those threes in there today. Okay, another question is, you talked about both Ascernity and Valista. When would you, how do they know which to use when?
Yeah, good question. So for the most part, when I talk about Ascernity, probably its strengths are a lot of the foliar type diseases. So things like brown patch and dollar spot that we talked about today. It has activity on leaf spots and other things. It's probably not as strong on maybe some of the patch type disease or the root infecting diseases. And so that's where I think I would utilize Valista, especially for diseases like fairy ring or summer patch. I think Valista is going to be much stronger on some of those root infecting diseases than maybe something like Ascernity. So, the other thing to keep in mind is that there will be a limitation, at least here initially for Ascernity, for 2 applications a year. And so, when we start talking about, which diseases you really want to focus on, you want to make sure that you're focused on the right ones with Ascernity, because you only really have 2 to work with throughout the whole season. And if you're using, any snow mold materials that contend, those count against that total. So it becomes even more important to make sure that you're really focused on the diseases, the strengths of both of those particular products.
And that makes me have to say the label is the law. And I appreciate all the research that you guys showed today was using label rates. And so I didn't feel I was going to need to say that. But, it is a good thing. We like to pay attention to those rules. Other questions, if anyone has them, raise your hand or type into the question answer box. I did also want to mention that applications are now open for the 2020 Environmental Leaders in Golf. That deadline is September 30th. There are 4 different categories now. We would welcome folks from around the world to submit for these awards to get recognition for themselves, their superintendent, their golf courses, and their commitment to environmental stewardship. If you have questions, you can contact us. There's the location on the website where you can find the application, which does not take long, I'm told, to complete. The Syngenta team will be doing other webinars here on the 26th and then at September 9th as well. You can enroll for those now. I'm being asked to repeat that number for education points. So that is 999-2333-3910. And if you're listening to this in the recording, make sure you put in the day you're listening and not the day of the live event, so it gets credited to your correct cycle for education points. I'm seeing no other questions here. Matt, Lisa, any other closing remarks today?
Just thanks for having us.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate your attendance.
Yes, we certainly do. Thanks to Syngenta for their support of this and other GCSA programs. And we will see you all online again soon. Have a great day. Stay well, everyone.